It's a 2002 Honda Odyssey, and I'm going to try to take out the transmission. The first thing I'm going to do is pop off all these clips and take this top plastic piece off. Okay, once all the clips are popped off, you can remove it. Okay, to remove the bumper, just go underneath and remove every clip that you see. There's one there. There's one there. And it should just be all along the bottom. On the corner of the bumpers, there should be a bolt, and I think it's an 8mm bolt. Once you get all those out, you should be able to pull on the corner. And take out the whole bumper. The next thing that we need is a splash shield. There's a clip there. There's another one here. Another one right here. On both corners, you'll also need to remove the clip that's right there. Once you remove that clip, there's also one more below it. And there's one last clip by the oil filter. Right there. Once you got all those out, the splash shield should just come out. Okay, the locations for the clips that we took off. One is right there. One is right there. There. Here. Here. One is right there. And I think the last one was right there. On the front of the splash shield, I think those are the holes that went to the front bumper. To drop the transmission, we have to raise the front by 2.5 feet, so make sure that the back of the van isn't too close to the wall. The first thing to do is put on the parking brake. At the top of the steering wheel, you need to pry this cap off. You'll need to use your key and push down on the button while you shift down 2 spots. So it's going to go from park, reverse to neutral. Next, we'll need to chalk up all of the wheels. And also, just before we have to jack up the front of the van to remove the transmission, you'll want to move these shocks back just a little bit, because these back wheels, when they roll backwards, they're going to want to ride up to the top of this chock, and your wheel will just be hanging in the air. Next, we're going to remove the battery. There's a bolt right there on the negative terminal that you have to remove, and for the positive side, there's a nut right there that you have to remove. Next, there's two hold downs holding the battery down. You have to loosen the nut that's right there, and on the other side, move the nut right there. For this, you'll need a long 10mm deep reach socket. To get the bracket off, just make sure that the hook on the bottom is out of the hole. Just like that. And then you can lift the hook off of the bottom of the battery tray. Do that to both sides, and then you can get the strap off. Before you can take the battery out, there's a clip here for the cruise control cable that you'll have to unsnap and then take the cable out. Okay, make sure you tape off or cap the positive terminal, and then you can take the battery out. Before we can take the battery box out, there's two wires that we have to snap off of the box. These two, and just keep organized. I'm going to write number 1 on the box, and on the wires I'm going to put number 1 and write a description of what it is, the side of the battery tray. That way I can match up the numbers when I reassemble this. Okay, so we're going to snap off these two wires off the box. Then we can take the box out. Okay, on the battery tray itself, there's a fuse box, and all you have to do is put a screwdriver right into this tab right here, lift up on it, and then pull the fuse box out. Okay, so actually it looks like there's two other connectors. This one and this one that's also connected to that same bracket. So here's the fuse box that we just pulled off, and instead what we're going to do is we'll just remove this 10mm nut, and we'll just take the whole bracket off. Okay, there's a lot of bolts on the battery tray. So one of them is right there. Another one is on the side, which I'm actually missing right there. And one of them is right there. Right through there. Okay, that green connector right there, push up on the tab and then you can pull it straight up. Okay, once we got that one out of the way, there is a bolt in there that we need. Okay, the bolt that we need is right in there. Really hard to see. It might be easier to get it from the bottom, but I'm going to try to do it from the top. Okay, for that last bolt, it's actually easier to get from the bottom of the fan. Okay, down here where the neutral safety switch is, if you look up, you'll be able to see the bolt. And it is right there by that connector. Okay, the last thing that's holding on to the battery tray is this air intake cover right here. There's this clip right here and this plastic clip, and the bottom of this cover is clipped onto the battery tray right there. So should be able to just pry this off. Okay, once you have that clip and that clip off, it's held on by this part right here. Just pull up on it and then pull the cover out. Okay, these two connectors right here, there's a tab on the bottom. Just push down away from the connector and then you can slide the connector out. Okay, it looks like there's one more thing that's holding in the battery tray, and it's this bolt right here. Just take that bolt off and you can take this whole bracket off. Okay, now we can take the tray out. Okay, so the front of the engine is here, and one of the bolts is right here. One is right here, the one that I was missing. One was right here, and the one that was hard to get to was, I think it was this one right here, where it's easier to get it from the bottom by the neutral safety switch. Okay, the air intake cover was attached to this grommet right here. One of the brackets that we removed was this one right here, and see, the other bracket that we removed was right here, and right here is where one of the connectors went to. Next, we're going to take off the engine cover, this airbox cover, and the tube here. Okay, for the engine cover, there's 10mm bolts, one here in the back, one there, and one more right there. Then just lift up on the engine cover. Okay, we're gonna start unplugging stuff from up here. And you can see that I labeled the things that I'm gonna unplug with numbers. So there's a 6, and there's another 6. There's an 8 right there, and an 8 here. So anything that looks like it's in the way, just label it and then unplug it. There's 2 more screws in the back of the airbox cover. One is right there, And the other one is right there. Okay, on the back of the airbox tube, by the brake fluid reservoir, there's this hose right here that you can just pull off. And it's this hose right here that I pulled off. And it goes into this tube, into the tube for the airbox. And that same tube snaps onto that clip there. So just pop it off that holder right there, and it's off. And there's a tube over here by the throttle cable. Just get a flat head and try to pry that off, or use hose clamps and twist that off, and then pull this hose out. Take this cruise control cable out of its clamp here, and then pull out on this airbox cover. And the whole thing should just come out. Okay, just now look at the airbox cover and tube. There's where one of the bolts was. There's the other one. Back here is one of them. And there's where the other one is. Okay, this is where one of the tubes that we took out. And here's where the cruise control cable was clamped onto. This is the band that we loosened to get this tube off. This is where one of the rubber tubes went to. And one of the tubes, actually, no, not this one, it clamped onto this one. And that same tube went into this metal pipe here. Okay, there's a pressure control switch connector right here. We're going to unplug that. There's some kind of a sensor here. We're going to unplug that. And there's a solenoid or some kind of other sensor right here. We're going to unplug that one too. So 1, 2, and 3 connectors. Okay, so just push on the tab here and pull this out. On this one, same thing, push on the tab on the back here, and then you can pull this out. And this one, same thing, push on the back tab here, and you can pull that out. Okay, this is the linear solenoid A and B. Just get pliers and clamp on this plastic part, and then squeeze it through its hole right here. So clamp on those two pieces of plastic on the side and then push it through this hole. And then on the solenoid itself, take out both of these connectors. Just push down on the tab here and then pull the connector out. Just like that. Okay, there's a ground cable here. Right there. Just take that bolt out and you can remove the ground cable. And it should be right there, right behind the starter. Okay, the ground cable is right under the starter. Okay, and that's the bolt that we just removed right there. Next, we're going to remove the starter. We're going to remove the ground cable and then the positive cable. Next, we have to release this Atf line to the radiator, and to do that, there is that black clip that you have to release. Just get a screwdriver in there and then twist it off, and then this will come off. Okay, this bracket right here is holding this positive cable onto it. So to get this clip off, push up on here, and then you might need a long screwdriver to pry it off here. Okay, this is optional. You don't have to do any of these, but I want these two hoses out of the way, or at least detached from the radiator, because I'm worried that if the engine drops too far, it's gonna pull on this hose and it's gonna snap this hose off the radiator. I'm also gonna remove this ground cable right here. That could also get snapped off, and also this hose right here that also could get snapped off. Okay, to get this off, take a screwdriver, twist it counterclockwise, this one too, and then lift this off. Okay, the bolt for the ground cable is 14 millimeters. Okay, and I'm just gonna put this bolt in. That way I know where it goes. Okay, you can see that I labeled it 12 and 12 on the cable. This tube, you should be able to just twist it off by hand. Just like that. Okay, the radiator petcock to drain the radiator should be down there. So if you go to the bottom, okay, if you look underneath, there should be a cutout right here. Right here, this cutout here. The plastic screw, if you can see right there, just twist that counterclockwise if you're looking at it if you're standing from the driver's seat. So just turn it counterclockwise and it should drain the coolant. Okay, it is draining, but to make it go faster, just loosen this cap right here. Okay, we could try to take the hose off from here, but because of this radiator support, or whatever this is called, taking this clamp off right here is really hard because you don't have a lot of access here. So it's actually easier if you just take this plastic thing off. And we're gonna remove it from here and from there. Okay, that hose is going to be stuck on there, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a rubber glove and I'm going to wrap it around this hose here while I take some pliers and try to jiggle it off. Okay, just so I don't break connectors, I actually took this connector off and also this connector right here off. I'm going to put them right back, but I just need room so that I can twist this wrench here. Okay, actually, this connector right here is also in the way. Okay, so while I'm twisting this back and forth here, I also have my other hand on the hose here, and I'm twisting it at the same time as I'm twisting this wrench. That way you'll slowly loosen it. Just keep going and eventually it'll come off. Okay, you can see that's loose, and just hold it up just in case fluid comes out. Okay, this lower radiator hose here, just push up on this connector and then you can loosen the clamp. Okay, while you're twisting on this hose, just make sure you don't break this connector off. And I unplugged this connector because it's in the way. So while you're doing that, also use your other hand and twist on the bottom of the hose. Okay, once it's free, just make sure it's up so the fluid doesn't go out. Okay, just under where that radiator hose was, we need to remove that brown connector, and there's also a black connector right behind it. We need to remove both of those connectors. Okay, it's really hard to see, but basically push in on this tab right here and pry up on this connector and it'll come off. And for that black connector, it's the same thing. Push in on this tab right here, and then lift up on it, and it should come off. Okay, I just remembered we forgot to take the starter off. There's a 17mm bolt on the top. And I'm actually gonna need two hands. It's on there pretty good. Okay, actually I just need a breaker bar. That wrench is just way too flimsy. Okay, it's going to take a while, but eventually this bolt will come out. If you go underneath the car, it's really hard to see, but right there in the center, that's the bolt that you need to get out. Right between that big hose and those two wires. You can get it from on top, but on the bottom you can see which bolt you're trying to get out. Okay, if you use an extension and a breaker bar, you should be able to get that bolt out. Okay, once you break it free, you can put a ratchet on it with a cheater pipe. And then once that's loosened, you can just use your wrench. Okay, this is the extension I was using. It's a pretty short one and a 17mm bolt, or I mean socket. And then once you get the bottom bolt out, you can pull it out. And actually, it would have been better if we took out the the bottom one first, because I actually had to put the top bolt on while I was unscrewing the bottom one so that the starter didn't just fall out while I was trying to unbolt it. Once you get the top and the bottom bolt out, you should be able to just take the starter out. Okay, this is the top, so the small bolt goes to the top and the longer one goes to the bottom, the one that was hard to get to, right there, and that's the long bolt. We could have just taken the bracket off, but I thought it was easier just to take the hose and the connector off. Here's the negative lead that we took off, or the ground lead, and here's the positive. And I'm not sure what that one is, but this one's usually not taken off. Okay, next we're gonna take off both of these. Just push on the tab and pull it out. Okay, and there's a clip here. Okay, right here's a 10mm bolt for the dipstick tube. Okay, we're going to take the dipstick out, and the tube should be held in by an O-ring. Okay, this thing has a zip tie right there, and if you get some pliers and push together the plastic tabs, you can just knock this thing through. And it was in that square hole. Okay, right here looks like some kind of ground cable, so we're going to take that off. Alright, we're going to take off this connector. Okay, there's this clip right here that we need to take off. And that was for this breather tube, the one that clipped onto the, I think, the lower radiator hose. Okay, before we take off these ATF hoses, we're going to drain the ATF fluid. So all you have to do is, you don't even have to jack up your van. Just go down here, and right there, this is a 3/8 bolt. So just put your ratchet on here, and you should be able to take that off. Right there. Okay, back up on top, we're going to take off this clamp. And this clamp. And then we're going to remove the hoses. One of this, I think, okay, this one comes from the transmission. It goes into the radiator, comes back out, and it goes back into the transmission with this bottom one. Okay, put a glove on and use the wrench to loosen that bottom one because it's really stuck. Okay, once that's loosened, you can just take it off by hand. Okay, that bracket for those lines has a 10mm bolt. Okay, this, the main top part is held on together by what looks like this bolt here for one of the Atf lines, and it looks like the easiest way to do it is take off this 10mm bolt right here, and then just go around and try to take off this top plate, because if we were just gonna get this main hardness off, it looks like there's a bolt back here that's impossible to get to. So this is probably the easiest way. Okay, we're going to take this green connector off. And behind it is a 10mm bolt that we're going to take off. Okay, now this whole bracket will come out. Next, we're going to take this 10mm bolt right here, and we're going to take, we're going to actually just disconnect that connector, and then we're going to take that one off, and we might need to take off the one right in there. Okay, for this connector, just push down on this tab and then push this out. Okay, this one is a 12mm bolt. Okay, the one that's next to it looks like it's 10mm right there. So we're going to try to get it from the top. Okay, we're going to unclip this one right here, pull this tab out, and pull it up. And this main piece right here, just pull it out towards the driver's seat, and it should lift off of that that tab right there. This main harness is out of the way. We can get to that bolt right there that was hard to get to. And it was that hole right there. What that did was it freed this bracket right here, which we can slide out of the way now. And if we have to, we can now take out this bolt and this bolt for the cooler lines. Looks like before we do that, we'll have to take off this part right here. Well, I guess before we move, we can clear this. We have to take off this hose. Okay, the only way I was able to get this hose off was to use a flathead and push back on the hose. Well, I use these hose pliers to keep twisting it off. It's these kind of pliers. Okay, with those two separated, you should be able to take off this pipe now. Okay, I figured out what this piece is. I put the bolt back on it. This is a passage body for Atf Fluid. There is a gasket under it, and to get the transmission out, we don't have to take this off, and we can actually take off these two inlet and outlet pipes later because they're not attached to anything that needs to be removed right now. That passage body also attaches to the external filter. I don't know if you can see it right there. It's like a miniature oil filter, just like the engine has, but smaller. And that's replaceable if you want to. And I'm not sure yet, but we might have to take off some of these lines. I'll check that later. Okay, I decided I'm going to take off both of these cooler lines for the ATF because they're the tallest thing on the transmission. So just in case it's going to be a problem later, I'll just take it off now. It's going to be a 17mm bolt for both of them. This one too is also should be 17mm. Okay, once you got them off, you can take the bolt off. Looks like there's a washer on it too. And there's the second one. Same thing, there's a washer on it. And now both pipes should be free. So, looks like this one's on top. It looks like it's still attached to this wire right here. And the other one looks like it's also attached to a wire down there. Okay, so it looks like those two wires go to the transmission range sensor or neutral safety switch. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this plastic tab right there. And also the other one, the other plastic tab, it's right in there. Okay, so underneath, right there is where the tab is. Okay, and the other cooler hard line is right here, and that's where the other tab is. Just remember that there was an aluminum washer on here, on this side of the bolt, and then before the bolt went in, there was one on the opposite side too. So 2 washers, and then the bolt head on top into each of those holes. Okay, we're gonna try to get the thing at the end of the filter. So where my wrench is, there's a 10mm bolt there, and right there is another one. So there's one on both sides. And to get to the back one, you'll need to put your wrench like that. And this is actually an offset wrench. So offset wrench is going to look like this. That way it clears that center bolt right there. So maybe you can do it with a regular wrench, but this seems to work. To get the back one, I used a really small 10mm socket and a wrench like this from Harbor Freight. It's got 2 ends. So using this, you can just barely fit it in there. And the wrench is underneath all that wiring. Okay, and that's what the bolt looks like. It's really hard to get to. After you loosen it enough, you'll have to just go under and untwist it with your fingers. It's a lot faster that way. Okay, the last connections looks like in the very back. There's this connector right here, which it's kind of just like this connector. Just push up on here and you're gonna pull it out the same way. So for this one, so you can pull the tab out from the back and then pull it straight out. And it's that one right there. Okay, it's really hard to see that connector, but where my screwdriver is, that's a tab on the connector. Lift up on it and then pull that connector out. Okay, it's that connector right there, where that flathead screwdriver is. Just pull up on that tab and pull out that connector. Connector right there. It actually could be a sensor or a computer. Okay, it looks like this wire connector right here is attached to this bracket with this plastic piece. Looks like if you just get some pliers and clamp down on that plastic piece, you can push it out of the bracket. Okay, so I was right. Basically just push it together and then pull it out, and there's the hole that it came out of. That white piece right there. Okay, it looks like the only way to get this bracket that's in front of the filter out of the way is to either get that out. Looks like the only way to get out of the way is remove this hose and this bolt right here, which is really hard to see, but there's that bolt right there and that hose right there. If you can remove that bolt and that hose, it should free up enough space so that you can remove that bracket up there. Otherwise, there's a cooler line right. Not sure if you can. Right, so there's a cooler line right there that you'd have to remove, and also you'd have to take out the bracket. Bolt should be right there. So take off that bolt to get this bracket off, and again the other way is remove this small bolt and that hose off to get that off. You might not even need to, but for me, I'm gonna do it because this hose right here is sticking out, and we could just remove the top right there, the hose right there. Either way you want to do it, it's okay, as long as the electrical connections are out of the way. Okay, so the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to try to remove the cooler line from up top. It's just like the other two cooler lines, except it's really hard to do. It should be right in there where the end of that socket is. Okay, there's a hole where right there, that hole, and the bolt is a special one. So there's actually a bracket bolted to a bracket bolted to another bracket. So looks like the easiest way is to take out this looks like a 12mm nut right here to take out the main bracket, and that probably will release the whole thing. Looks like in order to get to that bolt to remove it, we have to first remove this because I can't get a wrench into there. Okay, actually it looks like that's all we needed, because now this whole thing is free. So we didn't need to loosen this one up at all. So now it's free all the way to where the cooler pipe connects in the back. You can't see it, but just take my word for it. So it's free up here, and it's also free up here. So we should be able to take the whole thing out. Maybe get a flathead and pry this part off. Okay, it took a really long time, but if you wiggle it from here and try to wiggle it from here and also from the inside on both sides, just back and forth slowly, eventually it'll come out. Looks like it's only held in by that O-ring, but it almost was like it was rusted in there. So just take your time and eventually that'll come out. And that was the only part that I was worried about, because that line is right up against the frame of the van. So I was worried that it would get caught on the side of the frame or the unibody when you try to lower the transmission, and it might get caught on the corner. Okay, it's a real hassle, but basically what I did was I took this part and I brought it up and out of here, and then this part right here, I just kind of fished it out and under here. So it's really hard to explain, but basically this, it was under all these wires, so I fished the end up through here because it's connected by that rubber, this rubber hose, so it's flexible. So I fished it out and up here, and I got that under all of this, and I fished it out that way. Okay, so this was sitting on the back of the transmission, and there was a bolt that went through there. We took that bolt out. This is free. And on here, I think it was this bolt that we tried to get out. And then once we did that, this whole thing was free. And this was the other thing I was saying, maybe we can just disconnect this, but it seemed better just to disconnect the whole thing. And this is what was plugged into the transmission oil filter with the two 10mm bolts here. This one was really hard to get out. Also, just remember that when you do change the filter out, you should change out this this O-ring right here. Okay, another thing that I'm gonna do that might be optional is remove this nut right here so that I can take this bracket off, because I don't like how it sticks up. It might get caught on the unibody. Okay, also this connector right here needs to be separated. Push down on here and separate it. It looks like that end goes to the transmission range sensor, and this goes to the harness, I think. Okay, these are separated. Just push down on this tab, and actually I had to get a flathead and pry up on all around this edge to get it apart because it's on there pretty tight. Okay, for the bracket, I'm just going to use an extension. Okay, that connector with the green cable, that's one of the oxygen sensors on the exhaust. It's easier to just remove it right now. Just push down on the tab and then push the connector straight down to the ground. Okay, this connector right here, this one goes to the range selector right down there. So you'll need to disconnect this or it's going to snap off when you try to lower the transmission. This went into the bracket, so that's not the one that you need. It's right here. Push down on here and then get a flathead and pry it off at the seams right here, all along the seam. Okay, I'm being extra cautious, so obviously this is optional, but I'm going to take off that pressure sensor right there. That's either the third or the fourth pressure switch. I'm going to take that off just in case it gets stuck and breaks off. It's a 22 millimeter, so just get any wrench that you can and it should slip right over there. I think I paid like $50 for this, so I'm being extra paranoid. And there is aluminum washer at the end, so don't lose that. Okay, next on both sides of the van, there's these rubber stoppers for when you close the hood. Just twist them and then set them somewhere else, like maybe here. We're going to build braces to put on both sides of the vehicle. You're going to take a 2x4, and I think it's 21 or maybe 22 inches. Just measure it from when it hits here until it gets to about right here. So what you're going to do is cut that piece. I put a screw here, it's a 2.5 inch screw. That way it stops right there. You don't have to do this. And on the bottom there's another piece of 2x4. So I screwed it in from the bottom here and here. It probably would have been better to countersink it because this one sits a little bit above the wood. At this piece right here, you see that I messed up a few times, but where you want this one is where this hole goes. And you don't want it just in the middle of this hole. You want it touching the bottom so that when it's on there, the wood doesn't move down. And these rubber gloves, I cut them so they're single layer because that way that if there's two layers, it might slide past each other and that would defeat the purpose. So the top goes here and the bottom should go right into the hole. I'm hoping that once the engine's weight is on this, it won't slide as much. Okay, same thing with this one. On this side, when it hits there, start your measurement there, and then roughly when it gets to there, and then the hole you'll want to line up to is this one right here. So right now you can actually see it won't go down, but if I lift this part up and try to line the bottom screw that I made first, the top will go down. And then put the rubber pieces down. We need to separate the transmission from the engine. So that bolt right there, I believe it's a 17mm. And you're just gonna look all around the transmission edge and see where all those bolts are. Okay, for that one you can see I've got an extension on it, and this is a 1/2 inch, and I've got a long breaker bar on it because these bolts are pretty good and tight in there. I actually had to use 2 hands. I already broke it. That's why it looked like it was really easy. That's what it looks like. This one's also hard to get to, and it's on top. Should be right in there. Yep, this bolt right here. That one right there. Use the same 1/2 inch drive extension, and it's gonna go under the extension's gonna go under this main wire harness here, and the end of that socket is where that bolt is. Okay, we're going to loosen up the bolt of the top engine mount, or the front engine mount, just that top bolt. We're also going to remove that side bolt later on. Okay, you'll need a really long extension, and it's going to be a 17mm bolt. Okay, this is an engine support bar. It's from Harbor Freight. It was $75 or $60 with a 20% coupon. It's actually a little bit short, that's why we made those two wooden braces at each end, but they're all pretty much going to be about 59 or 60 inches, so it's going to be short no matter what. And the ones that were long enough were like $200 or $300, which is just way too much. So this one says it's 1,000-pound capacity. So the engine is about 500 or 550 pounds, and the transmission is about 250 pounds, I think. There's the item number right there. Alright, this is the engine support bar here. I did try to put two wrenches here. I can't remember it. I think these are 17mm bolts and nuts. But doing that, I couldn't get enough leverage, so what I had to do is put a wrench on one of them and then use an electric impact gun. This one is Porter cable, and that's the model number, PCE 211. So if you can tell, it's slightly tilted this way because the front is tilted down, so I compensate a little bit. And I know that once we lift up the front of the vehicle, it'll get even straighter, so I left this slightly less down. And I put screws here and here to hold it in place, and I put this bar here so it doesn't slide down. 1, 2, 3 screws. These are 2.5 inches, so it goes down about here. And all these you'll want to drill a hole beforehand. So these are 5 32nd drill bits. So use this to pre-drill it so the wood doesn't split. Here's a look at the other side. Same thing, 3 screws here. It butts up against the back here. And 2 screws here. So this is the chain that was included with the kit, and it's actually smaller than the hook, and it's probably okay, but instead I just use regular size chain. So I'm going to use this chain, but before I can, or actually just for extra safety, I'm going to go ahead and remove this sensor. Not sure what it is. There was a 10mm bolt here and another bolt on the other side that I've already removed. So this bracket right here was under the sensor, and it was they both use the same screw. This is just underneath the sensor bracket. So disconnect this hose in the back, and then you'll be able to get this out of the way, just in case it would have broke with the chain there. And then this, we can do the same thing. We'll just disconnect one of these hoses here, and then we can get this out of the way. Okay, so undid that hose, and the sensor is now out of the way. I just put it under here, and this bracket can also be out of the way. And then now we can put the chain under here, and it doesn't seem like there's anything under here. Okay. my chain was actually long enough to wrap it around twice, so that's what I did. Just started right here with this chain right here, wrapped it under, and went to here, put it over this hook, and then actually just kept going and went around and wrapped it from here all the way under and then back up again on this side. And I still have some slack, so this is a pretty long chain. And then I can adjust the tension right now using this right here. And I actually did grease up this with moly grease. Pretty much any kind of grease would work. And you probably don't even have to grease it, but just put some tension on it here, and then it should be good to go. And almost everything seems to be disconnected or loose here, so it doesn't break when we drop this transmission. I actually might disconnect the range selector later, and there's some other things I want to check back here when the car's jacked up, so I'll do that later too. Before you do this, make sure your parking brake is set really good and that your back wheels are chocked so it doesn't roll backwards. Then you're going to get a jack, and we're going to jack up on the tow hook here. Once you have the front of your car jacked up high enough, you're going to locate your jack point right here on the pinch weld, and you're going to put your jack stands on both sides in the front. Then you can remove all your lug nuts. It's actually easier if the car's on the ground when you break these free, but I've got an electric impact gun, so I could do it in there. Remove all your lug nuts and take your wheel off. Then for now, we're going to put the wheels under the front just for added safety. We're going to relieve the tension off the jack, but we're going to also keep it there just for safety too. Okay, here's the van after it's been jacked up. Wheels there, and I've got a spare one that's not holding any weight right now, but just in case my 6-ton jack fails, I've got a backup. Okay, we're going to remove the exhaust, and right here there's 1, 2, and 3 nuts that you need to take off. If these are stuck, you can use a long barbecue lighter or a propane torch or a heat gun. Okay, we disconnected this oxygen sensor from the top right here. Okay, this is the second part of the exhaust that you need to disconnect. There's 2 bolts there, and on the other side there should be that nut right there. Also, you need to disconnect this and this. It's a holder, and it's got a piece of rubber on it. And also, the end of the exhaust, there's this nut, that nut, and another one that's hard to see, but it's on the other side. Take those off at those 3 places and the exhaust should come out. Oxygen sensor cable wasn't actually disconnected. Push on the tab and then pull that connector apart, And then here, get some pliers, push it in, and then push it out of the bracket. And that should free up the oxygen sensor connector. Okay, in the front of the exhaust, leave a couple bolts here and then undo the rest from the middle to the back so that there's something still holding the exhaust up. And then put a jack right in the middle with a block of wood, and then once you take out the last bolt in the front, lower the whole exhaust down. And then at this point, you'll have to pull the exhaust forward because it's getting caught on the back studs. Okay, so the back of the exhaust has this hole, this one, and this one. And actually, the best way to get them off, because they're so stuck, is just to take a long barbecue lighter and just hold it up to the nut for about 20 to 30 seconds to loosen it, and then immediately put your breaker bar onto the nut and give it a quick jerking motion to try to impact it off. If that doesn't work, add some more heat to it and just keep trying. That's the best way. Trying to muscle it off is really hard, and sometimes you'll slip and you'll mess up the nut like I did here. So if you do mess up the nuts, don't reuse them. Because if you couldn't get it off the first time, if you try to put it on and try to get off next time, it might not come off. So it's better just to buy new ones. Okay, so this shock absorber, which is also a holder, has these two bolts onto it, 14 millimeters. The nuts are also 14 millimeters. And there's two of them. Just take those off. And then in the middle, underneath, there's going to be a 14 millimeter here, here, and here. Take that off and also use the barbecue lighter. Here's the connector. I found the best way to get this off is put it back on the bracket and then actually, see, I was trying to push down on this. I was trying to push down on this tab right here and trying to take the connector apart. But actually this part right here connects to the bracket, so I was pulling on the wrong part. Up here is where the connectors connect together. So push on that part and separate it. So don't try to separate the connectors with this. This is the bracket holder. And that's the oxygen sensor. There's actually just one oxygen sensor because the other one is on the catalytic converter. And in the front of the engine is the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 14 millimeter nuts. I think I did use anti-seize on these because I've taken this exhaust apart before, and even the anti-seize can't take the heat of the exhaust. So probably the best thing next time is just don't tighten these things so much. Okay, here's the end of the exhaust removed, and here's the middle one. And here's the front part. Okay, here's the shifter cable. We need to remove this cover right here. So 12mm bolt here, here, and it's also here, which is blocked by, it's blocked by this. So there's actually these two bolts here, which look like they're 10mm bolts. Remove that and you should be able to access that bolt. And then you should be able to take the cover off. Then if you push back, you'll be able to take the cover off. Okay. Looks like there's a safety tab over here. Bend this metal out, and here too, bend that out, and then you should be able to take the bolt out, and then this should just slide out this way. Okay, I'm just using a flathead to bend this out. Okay, and the bolt is just 10mm. Okay, here's what the bolt looks like. Use a flathead to pry this off. Okay, now we're going to move the caliper. So there's a 14mm bolt right here, and below there's another 14mm bolt right here. So first break them free with a 14mm breaker bar, and then once you've done that, you can use a ratchet And same thing with the bottom. Once you remove the bolts from both ends, you should be able to take the caliper off. And then we're going to hang this off of the shock. I put a bungee cord through this hole right here, and it hangs up on the spring there. Okay, next we're going to take off the caliper mounting bracket. So it should be this 17mm bolt, and on the bottom, same thing, 17mm bolt. And then the whole bracket should come off. Next, to get these Phillip heads off, we're going to use an impact screwdriver. So just hit the end of this with a hammer and twist it while you hit it. If these things are too rusted on and you can't get them off this way, you'll have to drill out the body through here. And then the heads will fall off, and then you'll be able to take this off. Once these Phillip screws are off, you can take the rotor off. Okay, get a chisel and bend out this tab for the axle bolt. Then you can use a 36mm socket here and use a breaker bar with a 4-foot cheater pipe, or just use an electric impact gun like what I'm going to use. Next, for the outer tie rod end, I'm going to take out this cotter pin, and then we're going to take off this nut. Okay, the nut is 19mm, and you'll need a breaker bar. Okay, leave the nut on flush with the bottom of the bolt, and you're going to use your sledgehammer and strike it hard here, and then gently tap on the bottom to free it, and just keep hitting here and lightly tap on the bottom. Once it's loose, you're going to remove the nut the rest of the way. Once it's off, the tie rod end should pop off. Next, we're going to count the number of threads here, and we're going to double check it, and then we're going to write the number of threads that are showing on here. Okay, so the number of threads I counted on mine was 11, and we're going to put 2 wrenches on here. One on here, and this one is going to be on that nut, and we're going to loosen that nut. For some reason this nut was really stuck, so what I did was mix ATF with some acetone and put it in a squirt bottle, and I used that as fluid to break the nut loose. Sprayed it on here, and then I actually used a heat gun to heat it up a little bit, and even that wasn't enough, so I found a really big wrench. I put it on the nut, and then with 2 hands I turned the sledgehammer this way and just knocked it up, and that freed the nut loose. To say that I'm taking off this tie rod end, but it's optional. The reason why I'm doing it is because I'm gonna rebuild that power steering rack, so I'm just doing this ahead of time. But again, this is completely optional. I just put a wrench on here because there's flat areas that you can put a wrench on, and I'm using another wrench here to twist it off. And the same thing, this was stuck because it was rusted, so I just put this thing back in its hole, and I put a wrench here, and I tapped on it with a sledgehammer, and I kept squirting penetrating fluid into here. And just so it comes off easier next time, use a steel brush to clean off the rust, and use anti-seize when you put this back on. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with the spindle. We're going to take that cotter pin out, and then we're going to take that nut off just like we did to the tie rod end, and then we're going to hit it with a sledgehammer to free it, and then the spindle should pop loose. Instead of a cotter pin, it looks like it's some kind of special pin that applies pressure to the castle nut. Okay, there's 2 very large bolts that we need to take out. This one and this one. It's 22 millimeters, and you'll need to put another wrench on the back to hold the same 22 millimeter nut on the back. And so I've got my wrench there and my breaker bar on here. Okay, so the nut is loose, and before we can hammer this out, I'm gonna remove this bolt so I can get this hose out of the way. It's a 12 millimeter bolt. Before we hammer these 2 bolts out of the way, we're gonna want to free up the speed sensor. So that 10 millimeter bolt on the speed sensor needs to be taken out, and then you might need to get an adjustable wrench and just slowly work that back and forth until the speed sensor is free. It's usually rusted on. Okay, get your wrench on there and just keep slowly twisting it off, and eventually it'll come off. And then once the speed sensor does come off, Clean the rust off here with a wire brush and inside that hole, and possibly put some grease or anti-seize around here so it'll come off easier next time. Okay, next we're gonna punch these bolts through on both of them. This is a 17mm bolt. It's easier if you have an impact wrench to spin this off. If this thing just spins, then you'll need to put a hex head here while you get an open-ended wrench or a line wrench or flare wrench to twist it off while you hold the Allen wrench. I actually ran into a problem. These threads are stripped out, and I've put the spindle nut back on, and I've struck this with a sledgehammer, and I've put a propane torch around here, and nothing seems to work, because I think what happened is this axle was rusted to this, and there's one way of getting it off, but the tool costs a lot of money. And so in any case, this thread is damaged, so I'm actually now gonna have to replace this hub, this knuckle, and the axle itself. So this is probably worst case scenario. You probably will be lucky and this will just tap out, because my other side did tap out, but for some reason this one's rusted shut, so I'll have to replace this whole part. See, on the other side, the driver's side, you can see this one actually tapped out pretty easy, but for whatever reason the other one was rusted. So if you do run into that problem, you might have to replace everything just like I did. Okay, so I've already removed both of those large bolts at the top of the knuckle, and this one was also rusted, but what I did was I took a propane torch and I just heated up here and where the threads were. I just heated up for about a minute or two, and then I used a 17mm offset wrench, and I used a sledgehammer on this part and I knocked it loose. This is pretty much the only tool that would fit back there, because a regular wrench, a regular ratchet won't fit here. Also, in order to knock that loose, you actually have to put the tie rod end back on. That way it holds it while you knock that other nut loose. Okay, so we're going to take the tie rod end back off, take the nut off, and then take the tie rod end back off, and then spin it off. Okay, the right drive shaft is actually two parts. It connects to the intermediate shaft here, and to get the drive shaft off, just put a pry bar or any piece of metal here and then hammer it out, and it should come off. To get the intermediate shaft out, there's 3 bolts, one right there, one on top that you can't see, and there's one right here. You don't need to take this bolt and the one on top off, because it's just a heat shield. Once you do that, you should be able to pry off at the end here, and you should be able to pull the shaft straight out. Once you use a breaker bar to break those 14mm bolts free, you can use your ratchet and get it out the rest of the way. The thing you gotta watch out for is this hose right here for the power steering. Once you have all three 14mm bolts removed, the shaft should come out pretty easy. Okay, the two bottom holes have shanks on the bolt, and the top one is just a straight bolt. And so this end attached to the drive shaft for the right side, and this went into the transmission. Okay, so here's the entire assembly, and if you can see, these threads are completely damaged, and unfortunately I'm gonna have to toss the whole thing because since I can't get the axle out and it's already damaged, there's nothing else I can do except order new parts. If you run into this, you'll probably have to do the same thing. I've heard of people taking these to the shop, and even a 125-ton shop press can't get it out. And fortunately, these parts aren't that too expensive. I actually found the knuckle on eBay for 200 bucks, so it's not a huge loss for me. Okay, to get the knuckle off, just put a piece of wood under the axle and put a pry bar under it, and then you can pry off the knuckle off of the lower control arm. Another thing that you can do is use a ball joint separator, and you might have to actually put back one or both of the bolts for here. End up with a lot of parts, so you can actually store it inside of the van if you don't have the space. For the driver's side axle, you can put a pry bar right between here and then pry out the axle. Next, we're going to take off this bolt and this bolt to take off the cover plate. Okay, these are 10mm bolts. Take each one off, and then a 19mm socket to spin the crankshaft. And each time you spin the crankshaft, another bolt will come out, and it will be accessible for you to take out, and then just keep doing it until you get all of the bolts out of the drive plate. Okay, I'm gonna rebuild the power steering rack, so this is completely optional, but on the bottom by the bumper, take this off and pull this hose off, and then drain the power steering fluid. Okay, once we've drained the power steering fluid, we can put the hose back on. And next we're going to free up the power steering rack. So, starting from here, there is a hose, this hose right here. It's held on by that white clip. So if you look under, you'll see that there's that tab. Press both sides in and then push it up. Okay, down here is another white plastic tab. Get a flat head here and then pry it apart. Okay, once you pry it apart, you can lift this up. And then this line should be free. Follow that line down a little bit. You'll see this connection point right here. That right there is a 10mm bolt that you'll have to take off in order to free that line. Okay, once I removed the bolt here, I simply taped it and put it here. Okay, now we follow that line to the power steering rack. You can see that there's a bolt in the back right there, and in front of that there's another bolt right there. So take both of those bolts off, and I think there's a metal bracket that's being held down by those two bolts. Okay, so from under the car you can see a better angle with that bolt, which is right there. And so on the opposite side of that is the same 14mm bolt. Take both off and that bracket should be free. So it's on there pretty tight, so unless you're really strong, you'll need a breaker bar. We can get to the bolt on the other side. This hose right here is clipped on right under there. Just squeeze that plastic tab together and then push that connector out. Okay, you can see it out of its hole, but you can also see in the back there's a plastic tab that you could have unstrapped and then pulled it out. Okay, this connector right here, there's a tab on the back that you'll have to push in, and then you can slide it up and out of the bracket. And the bracket is right there. And then we're also going to disconnect under by the exhaust, by the rear engine mount. There's a 10mm bolt right there that's holding that line in, and over here there's another 10mm bolt that's holding this part of the line in. You have to remove both of them before you can get to that 14mm bolt for that bracket. Okay, for this part right here, there was actually a 10mm bolt right here, right through there, that I took out. so you don't have to get it from up top. Just take out the bolt that was right here and it'll free up this line. Okay, I have a 14mm socket, and that's a swivel socket that's connected to that socket, and a really short extension, and it's connected to my ratchet. It's a really hard bolt to get to. Any way that you can get to it, just do it. So once both bolts are out, you can pry the bracket off. And this is the bracket that we were trying to get off. That was so hard. Okay, here by the rear engine mount, there's a bracket here, and there's two nuts or bolts holding onto it. So loosen those to get this bracket out. Okay, this nut right here you have to hold on to, and this is a 17mm bolt. So this goes all the way through, and you'll have to hold that nut while you take off this 17mm bolt. I had a hard time getting this knuckle off of the lower control arm. It was getting stuck here, and what you're supposed to do is hit whatever this ball joint goes through, which is this hole right here. So you hit this side or the opposite side, but doing that didn't work. So what I actually did is, and you're not supposed to, but hit the lower control arm on this side and this side, just medium taps, and it'll vibrate this knuckle free. I also had a lot of trouble getting this tie rod end off, and so what I had to do was untwist it off of the power steering rack, and then once I got it off, I hit this and this side, and actually I just hit this and somehow it pops loose. So if you have trouble, try doing that. Okay, to get the bolt off here, put a 17mm socket here, and then put a 14mm wrench up top and hold it while you untwist that bolt. And there's the nut. And this is the bracket. Under the van, where the catalytic converter is, if you look right here, you'll have to remove that bolt. And where that bracket is, there's a nut or a bolt that you have to remove there too. And that should be the last bracket for the power steering rack. Okay, this bolt right here actually has a 14mm nut on the opposite side that you have to hold with another ratchet. And this one right here, where this bracket is, this is a 14mm nut, and I have to use a swivel socket to get to it. Okay, this 14mm nut right here, just use a long socket and you should be able to get to it. Here's the bracket. So here's the 14mm nut that you have to hold while you unbolt the 17mm bolt here. And this actually wasn't a nut, it was 14mm bolt. So the space is really tight, so this is really hard to get out. There's going to be 2 lines on the power steering rack that we need to remove to free up the rack. So one of them is this one right here, and we're going to use a 14mm flare nut wrench to get into here. It's really stuck on there, so you're going to have to put a 2-foot breaker bar on that flare nut wrench. Okay, that broke it free, so the rest should be easy. Okay, underneath, there's that hose right there that goes to the power steering. Unscrew the bolt on top and then slide off that hose clamp and then slide off the hose. And that should be the last hose that connects to the power steering rack. Okay, the trick of getting this hose off is just wriggle it back and forth. Don't try to brute force it out, because that doesn't seem to work. So just wiggle it in a circle back and forth until it finally pulls off of the pipe here. An overview of the setup I have for this. This is a 12-ton jack stand, and it's on the pinch weld. The reason why I have a 3-ton jack stand below it, which actually isn't supporting it right now, because this isn't adjustable enough to push up against it, but it's close enough. Every time I try to put the car onto the jack stand, it kept wanting to slide forward no matter how much I adjusted it. So I have that one just in case. And it also has a 2x4 on it. On here, you can see that here's the lower control arm. And on this one, you can see that the rubber's cracked a little bit. It's okay. I was going to replace it, but I decided that it's not that bad actually. And the ball joints, I just cleaned them up a little bit, and they're actually okay also. And that front bushing, the rubber looks okay. Okay, on this side, the passenger side, you can see I've got a 2x4 and it's on a jack. And it's supporting this part of the subframe. Once I take it off, I won't be able to use this. And what I'll actually do is use a scissor jack and probably place it on top of some wood and put another piece of wood to push up against the oil pan. Not here, but further down on the inside. And this lower control arm, the rubber is also cracked, but I decided it's not that bad. It looks really bad, but it's not that bad. Same thing with this ball joint. It looks okay. I do notice that there's no grease in it, so what we're going to do is we're going to take off this round clip. It's it's like a ring, and then we're going to take this off and put grease into it. Okay, so if you can see, there's actually a metal ring right here that you should be able to take off somehow and probably slide it up, over and off, and then this rubber piece should come off. Okay, so it basically looks like once you pull it up, just keep prying at it from around and just keep going around until it eventually pops off. And you can actually spin this piece of rubber that way you can get to that spring a little bit better. Okay, so basically just keep spinning it. And lifting it up. And that's the last piece right there. Okay, then you should be able to lift it up and over. And then we'll just clean off that grease and then put new grease in there. Make sure to get into that recess right there. And then we're going to re-grease it. I'm going to use is Moly EP grease, and it says for chassis, wheel bearings, but the ball joints, as far as I understand it, are part of the chassis and suspension. So also this is Moly, and from my understanding, Moly is for metal on metal, which that pretty much is. So my best guess is this is the kind of grease to use. You also could probably use you could use pretty much anything that says NLGI number 2, which is what this is. Right there. Something that's probably even more heavy duty would be Lucas heavy duty grease, which is green. You could also probably use the Lucas red grease, and they're both rated to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can get those pretty much anywhere. You can get that grease at Walmart, at probably AutoZone or O'Reilly's. To get into these hard to reach places, I'm going to use this syringe. This is actually for pumping water into your ear to get the earwax out. I've seen some syringes on Amazon that have metal needles, and they're about $12. But since I have this, I'm using this. There we go. And here's the boot cleaned up. And then next I'm just going to use like a plastic spoon or something to start packing it here, and then I'll put this back on and I'll keep packing it, and then I'll put that ring back on. Okay, so I'm going to keep packing it on the ball joint itself, but I think the easiest way is probably just shove the grease into the boot and then just put it over. Okay, so that looks about right, and then I just shoved a bunch here, making sure that the grease is on the bottom more than the top, because once it's on the bottom, it will just push out to the top anyways. Once you think you've pushed it down enough, just spin it to make sure it's down there. Ring on top, you're going to split the bottom part and you're going to slowly work it back into its groove down here. And I found this is pretty much the only way to get this back on. Okay, you can see that it's now in its groove on the bottom, and you're just going to work it around, all the way around, until the whole thing is seated down there. Okay, you basically just have to have a ton of patience and just slowly work this thing all the way down. Okay, probably didn't seem like it, but it actually took me like 2 or 3 hours to figure out how to put that ring back on. So just put the boot over the lip on the bottom, make sure it's seated all the way around. Just push down, spin it, and it'll get over that lip. And then you can put that metal ring on top, and then with a flathead and a really small plier, try not to puncture this boot while you do it, but get the bottom ring down over the lip and hold it, or whatever you gotta do to slowly get the top all the way around so it meets, so the whole spring meets together at the bottom. From inside the car, there's gonna be this plastic plate that you have to take off. These little plastic screws, just undo with your hand or jab a small plier in there and spin it off. There's one there, and there's also one right there. So just spin it off like this. Okay, there's also this metal band right here. Just take that off. Okay, if you can pry this up and over the carpet, you should be able to get it out. Okay, so I marked it with a permanent marker on the spline and on there, and on the bottom. I tried to mark it too. Okay, there is probably a 10mm bolt right here, and there's another one on the bottom. Remove both of those bolts, and then you should be able to slide it up, and then the power steering rack should be free. And there's where the bottom bolt is. Okay, for the front motor mount, we're going to take off the top nut. Just use a long extension and a 17mm socket, and here's the bolt. Okay, next we're going to be separating the transmission from the engine. We've already separated the two bolts on top. So here's one from the oil pan to the transmission. It looks like 14mm. And here's another one. And that one. And also should be one. Should be one right. There's one more right there. Okay, hit the ratchet with an impacting motion with your other hand while you pull on it. Like there's also this bolt right here, which I'm gonna break free, but I'm not gonna fully take this bolt out. So there's something keeping them together in case something goes wrong, and I'll take it out just before I remove the transmission. This one's actually 17mm. Okay, this next one is actually also 17mm. Okay, so we just removed this one, and the one above it is also 17 millimeters. For the front engine mount, we're going to unclip this hose here, just like that, and then in the back we're going to disconnect the hose from the engine mount. And then we're going to pull this out of the way and tuck it in here. Okay, there's two transmission mounts, one here and one right here, and each of them has two bolts on the bottom, one right there, one right there. And for this one, has the same thing, two holes. So there's a hole here and a hole right here. So just take those two 14 millimeter bolts out, here and here. Okay, actually instead of bolts, they're just nuts, 14 millimeters. So I got the two in the front, and then these are the two in the back. Okay, the back engine mount, we're going to take out all four bolts here, and they're 14 millimeters. Okay, so I broke it free with this longer ratchet, all four bolts. And then I can use this to take them off quicker. Okay, this thing was actually like 60 bucks on Amazon. PCE 211. Okay, so we're just about ready to take the subframe out. I showed you how to make these supports. Same on the other side. Screws, keeping it from going left and right. And this from keeping it from sliding all the way down. This is a 1,000-pound engine support. And it's double looped. This is extra, double looped, and on these hooks. This one is, since I had an extra one, this one's actually going to the transmission. I kept the hanger on the transmission, so I'm using that extra one to hook up to that to prevent the transmission from falling before I can remove it. So the transmission mount or transmission jack design that I've come up with is I've got this trolley jack, 3 tons, and it has to support the transmission at an angle. So I'm not going to use this 2x4. I'm actually going to use that 2x8, or I might make it smaller. Actually, I will, because I don't want it to hit the subframe on the side. So I'll make that shorter, and I'll cut a shim out of the 2x4. I'll make a shim to shove into the gap. And this, I just took off the top part of the jack, and I'm going to use a 1 3/4 inch hole saw, and I'll cut it. Actually, I might just cut this at an angle so that it's already at an angle, and then I'll try that. And then for the back, for a stop, I'll probably cut a piece of the 2x4 and you put it here because it's a good chunk of transmission, and so I'll use that, and then I'll put a ratchet strap all the way around to the piece of wood and the transmission together. Okay, this is the base for the transmission. This is a stopper right here, and this hole that you see is that, and it's a 1 3/4 inch bit. And also, let's see, so it goes on like this. Okay, this part right here, make sure that your stopper doesn't hit this shaft. Make sure it's shorter than that. So that's what this piece is for. And the reason why the hole is so far towards the end is because my guess is the center of gravity is gonna be where the hook is on the top of the transmission, which is basically where the bolt that connects to the engine and transmission is. So my guess was about here, but if you put the point where you jack it onto there, it'll rock this way, so it's not stable. You have to push it further in. And I actually think that this is actually the center of gravity, because it makes no sense for the center of gravity to be this far forward, because this is the torque converter. And so all the gears inside should be somewhere here. So that's why the hole is so far there. So it's gonna rest about there. And it's not gonna be touching this subframe, but my guess is the center of gravity is somewhere here. And you want to test it, make sure that it doesn't rock. Okay, so we've got a floor jack on both sides, and I'm guessing that the center of gravity for the subframe is somewhere here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take off all 4 corners of the subframe. So for this corner, it's this bolt, and then the bracket, which is this bolt, and this bolt right here. And then for this corner, the bracket is, there's this bolt right here, and then the bracket goes up to here. So there's this bolt and this bolt. And this ratchet is going to be for the wooden platform for the transmission. We're going to ratchet strap it around the wooden platform. Okay, I've got 3 blocks of wood. These are 12x2s, but you can use something smaller. I didn't use the stock scissor jack. This is this aftermarket, because the stock one looked kind of weak. and put a block of wood here under the oil pan, because the oil pan comes from here all the way to here. So I think it's better to put it here, because the only engine mount that's going to be still in place is the one on the side, which is that one right there. And that's the only one that's going to stay there. We're removing all the other engine mounts. Second jack with a piece of wood is going to hold this other side of the subframe. So you've got a jack on each side of the subframe. And the wood, it's not balanced, it's more on this side because I don't want it to interfere with the scissor jack. For this corner of the subframe, same thing, there's a bolt here, probably a 17mm. I think they're all 17mm. And then the other side of the bracket has that bolt and that bolt. Okay, so here's a look at where the other jack is. And same thing on the back corner of this one. There's going to be that bolt right there. And it looks like it connects, the bracket connects to here. Okay, I'm going to take off these lower control arms on both sides. So on the back, it's a 19mm, and the bolt is underneath, and I'm not sure if the top nut is welded on or not, but if it's not, then you'll need to put a wrench and hold it there while you take the bolt off underneath. And this looks like the same thing for the front part. There's that nut right there. It doesn't look like it's welded on. And the bolt in the front is probably a 19mm. So that should be the only thing holding this lower control arm on. Okay, so here's the bolt for the back one. And it looks like that top nut actually is welded on. One right there. So do not try to take that off, it's welded. And so if that's welded, I'm going to assume that the one for the back is also welded. One right there. And I don't remember if I said it or not, but you'll have to take off that stabilizer link on top, because the whole subframe is going to drop down. I don't think that you need to take this off. So there's the bolt, and that back nut is welded on. So don't try to take off either one of those nuts. And the reason why I'm taking off these low control arms is because I noticed that the bushing is ripped. So I'm going to try to press it out myself, and if I can't, Dorman sells a really cheap low control arm for $100 each. And you'll need to get one for the left and the right side. The front bolt for the low control arm is a little bit longer than the back bolt, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so what I did was I first took off the corner from back there, and then I took off the front corner here, and then I took the back corner off, and then I lastly took the front corner off here. That way there is at least the back and the front being held up at all times. Now all corners are removed. So hopefully now I should just be able to jack each jack down slowly, one at a time, back and forth, and hopefully if nothing's catching, the whole subframe should drop down. and I still have that jack supported to the engine, as well as that, and made sure that it's not too tight, but it's catching, and that's connected to the transmission, and so that's not too tight either. Okay, you can see that the transmission mounts, the bolts for it are actually separating from the subframe, and the front too. You can see that it's slowly separating, so the subframe is loose, and so you'll have to triple check that nothing's binding, nothing's still connected. This is probably one of the most important parts. So just make sure that you didn't forget to disconnect or unbolt something and nothing's catching. And you're going to slowly lower each side. Okay, looks like the only thing that's going to be a problem is this hard line right here, and it's connected. See that hard line right there, and it's connected to right here, so just make sure it doesn't get bound up on the power steering rack when it comes down. If you're not removing the power steering rack like I am, it won't be a problem. But me, since I'm going to rebuild this, and I would suggest you rebuild this because this whole subframe almost has to completely come out just to replace this power steering rack. So right now is the best time to rebuild it. So I'm going to keep lowering both sides, and I'm going to go and check the hard line for that power steering rack. Make sure it's not bound up as the subframe lowers. So far you can see the separation is still going, and same on the other side. It's a good amount of separation there too. So just keep double checking that hard line's not binding, and right now it looks like it's gonna clear. So I'm just gonna keep lowering everything down. Notice that you need to lower each one down a little bit at a time because one side will bind. I'm guessing because of the transmission mount. So I'm going to lower this one. Okay, and then we're going to do the other side. So you can see that this back transmission mount has completely cleared, and the front one also cleared. And so far, that hard line, I just keep having to push it up so it doesn't get caught on the power steering rack. This side you can see that this line right here is completely free, it's not binding. And so the only thing that I have to worry about is that line that I showed you right here. Just make sure that that's not binding, and making sure that this power steering rack is dropping down. Okay, now we're gonna drop this corner or this side down. Tip, that top part on the power steering rack, the one that connects to the steering wheel, that 10mm bolt actually went all the way through that that axle at the top, and I was trying to hammer it out and it wasn't working. Well, just make sure that you take that bottom 10mm bolt all the way out, and then the 10mm bolt on top, it just pinches on, so that top one you can leave loose, but the bottom one, make sure you take that bolt all the way out. And so now the power steering rack is dropped, or it's completely free, and we can drop the subframe the rest of the way down. See that the subframe, or at least this stabilizer bar or whatever it is getting caught on the catalytic converter. So you have to move this jack on this side up a little bit, and just make sure that it doesn't pull that catalytic converter all the way off. Okay, I don't know if you can see, but the subframe is actually dropping backwards because the center of gravity, isn't correct. But I'm thinking that's because the power steering rack is dropping down with it, and usually you're not going to do that. So I think it's actually, yeah, it's clear enough that I can take the power steering rack out, and that'll probably fix the balance issue. Okay, and you can see that this line is free. It's not binding. Yep, it fixed the bounce issue. So the subframe's cleared, but here's the scary part. I have to remove that support, which is a backup actually. And I have to remove that and hope that my setup on top is actually going to hold the entire weight of the engine and transmission. Okay, so that worked, and I just had to push down on here to get this bolt to clear. You could just remove the whole engine mount, but that's a lot of extra work. You also could have dropped it down to a dolly on the front and the back, or the sides, or however, but looks like the transmission support, or the engine support, is working. So that's pretty good. So the only thing left to do is make sure that that stabilizer link isn't caught, because it looks like it might be caught, and then pull the whole thing out. Alright, so it's not that big of a deal, but it looks like it wasn't balanced right. Okay, I'm actually not that strong, so that subframe isn't as heavy as it looks. I'd guess it maybe weighs like 75 or 100 pounds, something like that. But lifting off one side is really easy. Okay, so it's free. Okay, so I put the support back under the oil pan. I feel a lot safer this way because I will be rebuilding that transmission, or at least trying to. Hopefully it works. And so this is going to be like this for a long time. I think just shooting this video for the transmission removal has taken like a month and a half already. It would have been a lot faster if I didn't do the video, but I didn't see this video on YouTube like a step-by-step, so hopefully this helps a lot of people out. So I put a little bit of pressure, not too much, because this thing is probably like, it says 1.5 tons, but probably only holds like well, maybe it does hold a ton, I don't know. But this is just insurance, even though I've got the setup on top. Because this, to me, it's probably strong, but it seems kind of risky. So it's better safe than sorry. Last look. Put the strap right around here, under to the board, and now it's a good time to double check that everything's free and it's gonna drop out good. This cable right there, that's for the shift sensor, the neutral safety switch, whatever it's called. And then you're gonna need to double check everything up here is free and clear. Just lift up on these wires, make sure nothing's caught. This cable is gonna come down with it. I believe that's for the other side of the neutral safety switch. And just double check that everything is good to go. And then we're going to remove this chain just before, but we're going to leave it in place now just as a safety. Okay, so just to make sure, these are not the bolts that are attaching the transmission to the engine. This is what's holding the transmission halves in together. So don't take those off. I believe these are 14 millimeters. So as far as I can tell, that might be the last bolt to take off. I kept it there as a safety. And so once we remove that 17 millimeter bolt, the transmission should be free. And the only thing that we have to worry about is once we separate it, that the torque converter doesn't just drop and hit us. Okay. So it looks like actually this front engine mount is connected to the engine and the transmission. So remove this bolt, and there's probably a bolt on top, and just remove that engine mount. Or at the very least, remove the one for the transmission. Time to check the rear motor mount. I don't know if you can see, but this one is cracked and broken, so this is the best time to replace the rear motor mount because it's probably the hardest one to get out. And you're gonna look around the transmission case to see where you can pry it from the engine. So looks like there's a point here that you can hit on or tap on, and if you need to, just get a piece of wood and knock it on anywhere that looks safe. And so we need to separate the transmission from the engine and then slowly lower it down. It's starting to separate, but this might be binding it up, so I'm gonna loosen this and then take the chain off. Okay, taking that chain off did help, and it looks like lowering it a little bit, it would get binded here, but then I raised it a little bit, and then this front half separated. So if you get stuck just like me, just lower it a little bit, then raise it, and just eventually wiggle free. There are pins in here, and you need to clear them before you can lower it down. So just in case the center of gravity is wrong, we're gonna have this ratchet strap on this side so that somebody else can hold it in case it drops to the wrong side. Okay, so it's separated, and I'm just pushing here while the other guy's pushing the back apart to split the transmission from the engine. Okay, there's 2 pins at least in there that you have to clear. Just keep pushing it back and forth, and then just lower a little bit, and then you'll be able to clear it more. Everything's clear, so we're gonna drop it. Alright, we're gonna lower it the rest of the way.
Am I still under it?
Yeah, sort of.
Because if I go here and I back out with you.
Is it catching on anything?
No, not yet.
Is it catching anything?
Yeah, you can't pull it out this way because it's going to hit the frame.
Remove this hose right here because it's getting caught on this top of the transmission. So just take the clamp off and then just take this hose off. Like that. Alright, good. Anything?
Not that I can see.
Hey, can you get that up? Like,
Yeah.
still good?
Yeah.
Okay, what's it caught on?
It's the plastic, it looks like.
Okay. Okay, can you hold this back?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, and stop. This bolt and this bolt here because it's catching on this air box right here. So I had to remove this solenoid in order to get to this back bolt. Okay, with that hanger off, the top of the end of the transmission should fit through this gap, and it should clear the bottom of this. Okay. might actually have to take this off, or we could try jacking it up a little bit. Okay, I just saw something really obvious here. This transmission is easily going to slide out sideways. So instead of trying to fight with this box and stuff, just be smart about it and just go sideways. So we just rotate this transmission like this. Should just yeah, it easily clears it sideways. Okay, so this is one of the pins that we had to clear from the engine transmission before we could drop it. And then we actually had to lower the transmission a little bit before the back pin cleared. And then once you got that clear, everything else is pretty easy. You can see that the transmission is actually leaning towards this side because the center of gravity that I guess wasn't perfect. Center of gravity actually should not be here. It should be maybe here is where I'm guessing. But I couldn't put the wood here because of the subframe was in the way. So maybe instead of doing it the way I did it, take the subframe out and then build your wooden platform. Look at the engine, and this is not a flex plate, or actually maybe it is, but the diagram lists this as the drive plate. So one thing that's really important when you've got this separated is take off these bolts. They're not special, they look special. It's just what you do is use a 12-point socket and it fits perfectly onto those bolts. Take this plate off and replace the rear main seal on the engine. And also for this 5-speed, there's a tiny O-ring. You have to take off the whole plate to replace that tiny O-ring. Make sure you replace that. That's really important. On the 4-speed Odyssey transmission, it might not have that, so check the diagram for your vehicle. Here's a better look at everything that's been taken out. That's the hole for the to the steering wheel. Look at the top. It seems really complicated, and it sort of is, but once you break down all the steps and just pretend it's like a really long project, just work on it a little bit at a time, and you should be able to do it. Because if I was able to do it, then pretty much anybody should be able to do this. Okay, just one last thing is you can see that I've got two scissor jacks. The original one is on holding the oil pan at that spot, and the second one that I just put in is this one, which is holding the oil pan at the other side. That way it's gonna put less strain on the side engine mount, which is that black one right there. I'm gonna be rebuilding the transmission, and it's gonna take a long time, so I think it's better to take some of the weight off of the top engine support bar and the side engine mount. And just to add, they're not taking the entire weight of the engine. I'm using my fingers, and they're just taking some of the pressure off. And I use my fingers on this one too, so I'm not using the bar and cranking it really hard to take the whole weight of the engine off. It's just relieving some of the pressure. And this part, I don't consider optional. I noticed that this hose right here seems, it looks, maybe it's okay, but I think that you should replace this hose right here. If you go online, it's $25 for the OEM part. If you go to a dealership, it's probably more expensive. But since you have this available now, and it's really hard to get to, I would replace this hose. If you don't want to spend $25, you can just use just regular ATF tubing, transmission oil tubing, and just make your own hose. And hopefully it'll be able to bend around all these curves. But if it doesn't, then you'll need to get the OEM part. Part's optional, but I mean, since this is a 2002 van and it's 2018 now, that's like what, 16 years. I would replace this hose too. It's really expensive. It's like $134 online, and I would recommend the OEM part for this one. It's really expensive, but I mean, if you've got access to this hose down there now, I would just go ahead and replace it if you can afford it. Here's a look at the power steering rack. Make sure that you replace this rubber piece right here, because it seems like it's a little bit brittle. You can reuse it if you want to. It's not that serious, but I think it's only like $15 or $10. And you can see that this hose, or these two hard lines, the reason why I didn't loosen them, because you don't need to. It's connected to the rack itself, so it connects from here all the way to that side. So that's the reason why we didn't disconnect these two lines, these two hard lines. But we did disconnect this one. This is the one that was really tight, and we had to put a 2-foot cheater bar onto the flare nut wrench. And then this was the thing that I didn't see before. I couldn't get this rack to get clear of the top part through that hole. It was because the first 10mm bolt went through here, and that little notch, it captivates, or it captures the 10mm bolt. So you have to remove that bolt completely out in order for this thing to drop down out of the hole. And then the top part, the other 10mm bolt, you just have to loosen that so that it will slide off the shaft on the top shaft. I'm gonna rebuild this. Honda does actually sell a rebuild. It's like a kit. It comes with a bunch of seals and things like that. So you'll remove the entire thing, and there's a bunch of seals and things that you have to knock out in order to rebuild this rack. And I would definitely recommend doing that. And if you can't, I would get a rebuilt unit, because this thing requires dropping the subframe just to replace this rack. You could just reuse it if your rack is not leaking, it's running fine, if you can't afford it. But I would definitely recommend buying the $30 rebuild kit for this and rebuild it yourself. And it's OEM, so you can get it from places like Honda. It's like HondaAutoParts.com or Majestic Honda. And even at the dealership, it's probably around $30 or $40. Okay, the battery that I took off of the van, I've had sitting on the trickle charger the whole time. So that's just one thing that you can do. And I bought this 5-gallon or 3-gallon bucket of Evaporust right here. And what I do is I just take some of it and I put it in an old peanut butter jar that I cleaned out, and I stick all the rusted bolts in there. And so once they've been sitting there for, I think it sat in here for like a week or two, maybe longer. I just shook the jar like once a day, and then after I took it out, I cleaned it off with brake cleaner, and then after that dries, I'm gonna stick it in a jar of oil for probably a few weeks. You don't have to do this for a few weeks, but the evaporust definitely, it takes a few days. If you can afford it, just get new bolts, but if you want to reuse some of them to save some money, then you can do that. Just remember, the nuts that we took off the exhaust, if any of them are damaged in any way, just make sure we replace those. Don't reuse them. And here's one last look at the transmission. And that's the transmission mount. So the next project that I'm going to work on is trying to rebuild this. I have no idea what I'm doing, but this was the entire point of taking out the transmission, was to rebuild this. And what's weird is I don't see blue on this torque converter. That means that the fluid got burnt. But either way, I'm going to replace this torque converter because inside there's I think there's a friction plate or something that gets worn out, just like the clutch pack inside the transmission. And this thing's got 144,000 miles on it, so I'm definitely going to replace this torque converter. I just haven't figured out which one to get. And you can see that here's one of the pins that has to clear before you drop the transmission. And here's the other pin. It's actually a giant roll pin. And then obviously you're going to want to replace all the axle seals. But I'm not sure if the Transstar kit is going to be a good one, because I'm always worried that aftermarket seals leak. So usually you want to use OEM O-rings and seals. And there's the other transmission mount. And those both mounts I'm going to replace. And then this is the sticker right here that tells you what type of transmission it is. This one's BYBA because it's 2002. And I think 2002 to 2004 they're all 5 speeds. But they might not all be BYBA. And that's the oil passage body. So I think what happens is, okay, I believe from the pump inside the transmission, it goes out from here to the radiator, and then it comes back from the radiator back to here. And I forgot the flow, but the return also goes, I think it goes from here into the body, into this filter, and then back into the transmission. So it goes from here, radiator, back into here, something, and then it goes back into the transmission. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think that's about how it works.